Hi there, personal health and wellness. Welcome to the start of our health solutions. I'm so excited that we're here. This is really where I feel like the fun part of the class begins. We begin to have conversations to redirect or possibly reinforce what it is that you're currently doing to value that body of yours and to look at some really unique things that we can be doing in the future to continue that effort. So I want to start with kind of an obligatory liability statement here. And number one is everything I present to you is for informational purposes only. I do not take any position that ranks over your doctor or your healthcare provider in what you should be doing for your own personal health. So please make sure you consult with them before beginning any type of activity or exercise program. Number two, there is no practitioner or client relationship that is going to be formed in this information being passed to you. There is not any type of practice that is formed with this as well. Number three, every one of us is different. And you know that because we've kind of talked about individualism already. But to optimally use this information, I recommend that you first identify a mentor or someone in your life who is credentialed and can take this knowledge and apply it directly to your situation. And then the fourth thing is the special considerations. Like if you have specific medical conditions or physical conditions that need specific tailoring, then I highly recommend that you seek that out again from someone who's credentialed and can help you there. But be sure to keep safety as your number one priority as we move forward. All right, so with that being said, I want to take you into a very special website that I think that you need to begin looking at immediately. But it has several answers to our quizzes, but also just some really hearty information. And that comes from the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans, and that is at health.gov. And in here, in this link that you can apply into your URL bar and click on, what you're going to find is that information is incredibly valuable. Number one is it tells us some new evidence of what physical activity or exercise can give to us. And I wanted to just point out a few very specifically. Here I am. I'm out on a run in LaFleur County. We just had a really special view. This was recent with a friend of mine who hadn't seen in some time, and he was taking pictures, and so he snapped this one. Early morning sunrise view. But some of the benefits that I want to highlight first is improved bone health and weight status for children's age 3 through 5. That's an incredibly important topic as we start to embark on childhood obesity rates and the way they are climbing. And we'll look more into that when we touch body composition in a later module. Number two, improved cognitive function for youth ages 6 to 13. And who would not want for their children, especially in this age group, to have better cognitive functioning? This is the focus of why physical education, or PE, is so important in that age group. It's not only to kind of let them go out and burn off some pent-up energy, but it also helps to develop that cognitive focus. That way, when they are in the classroom, they can actually apply that focus. Number three, it reduces the risk of cancer at a greater number of sites, meaning across our whole body, we have a lower risk of cancer actually occurring at more sites. Number four, the brain health benefits include possible improved cognitive function. That's for us older adults. Reduced anxiety. That's speaking my love language right there. Anything that will take my anxiety level down, I love hearing that. The depression risk goes down. And then improved sleep and quality of life. You know that I'm very intrigued by sleep right now as I've been kind of sending you some emails about that. But I find that on days where I do not work out, I do struggle a little bit that night to sleep. Sometimes it's just my brain can't quite shut down, or I just don't feel quite like I've put forth the physical effort that I need to get that physical rest that I need to. The next bullet is for pregnant women: risk of excessive weight gain, gestational diabetes, and postpartum depression all go down. And I want you to think about this for a minute. We all know that a pregnant female is going to gain weight. That's a good thing because that means a baby is growing. But the other side of this is we have reduced excessive weight gain. And what we know is that many times a female can gain too much weight because of glucose control and what's happening there. And so the activity can help to balance that out. We're going to kind of dive deeper into that as well. For older adults, you reduce your risk of falls. That is the highest cause of death in age 65 and older. And so that's a wonderful statistic to tout. And then the last thing, for people with various chronic medical conditions, there's a reduce of all cause and disease specific mortality. Now that's very specific to say we see a across the board decrease in mortality for people with chronic medical conditions. That is diabetes, that is chronic lung diseases, all the big killers that we know that are out there. And so if we can see that decrease happen, all from physical activity, then I'm telling you, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to participate. Some other really great health benefits: lowered risk of all-cause mortality, lower risk of CVD, that's cardiovascular disease mortality, just lower risk of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, adverse blood lipid profile, that's the fats that are in your blood system, a lower risk of cancer, a lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, lower risk of anxiety and depression, and lower risk of falls. All things that we kind of looked at just a moment ago, but here it is in a bulleted order. But take a look at this too. A reduced weight gain or weight loss will occur. That's kind of integral because we notice that some people, as they get older, they just, especially in their well elderly years, they'll lose weight. And that's not always a healthy loss of weight. But also, just kind of as we advance into our third and fourth decade, we see a weight gain that occurs, and we see that reduced just by regular physical activity. Improved quality of life, improved sleep, improved bone health, and improved physical function. And this actually comes quite clear as we see people who will say, listen, I actually noticed that when certain things happen, like I was hit by a foul ball at my kid's game, and it didn't really hurt as bad as I thought it might. Well, that's because you have more strength to withdraw some of that. And so I will tell you that these are all factors that we need to consider and really put at the forefront of why we want to have physical activity as a part of our life. Take a look at this. We must move more. There's a relationship among moderate to vigorous physical activity, sitting time, and risk of all-cause mortality in adults. And if you take a look, the more you sit, the higher it is likely that you will die. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. But the moderate to vigorous physical activity causes us to move away from this said death area or mortality area into a life area. And so we've been able to link that in more than one study. But this is all from that physical activity guidelines. And I hope that you'll visit that webpage and find that booklet and just scroll through there and see what some of the unique factors are. So to start, we need to kind of have some groundwork on our terminology, and that groundwork really needs to include the way some of these terms are used. Physical fitness is simply a person's ability to carry out daily tasks with vigor and alertness without undue fatigue and with ample energy to enjoy leisure time pursuits and then respond to emergencies when needed. That's your physical fitness, and many times I think we kind of overlook that and think, well, it's how many squats we can do or how much I can bench press. And I think those are important factors, and we'll kind of get into that later too. But what I'm looking at here is just your overall conditioning. What can you do and not just be wiped out at the end of the day? Maybe still feel like playing with your kids or your dog, or just going for a walk with your spouse or your loved one, or just doing some simple yard work or housework that's important to be done. Because if you don't have a certain level of fitness, those things are going to be overtaxing to you, and you're typically going to put them off and put them off and put them off, and they're never going to get done. But if you have that energy, if you have that fitness level, they will get done. The other side of this is what a physical activity is, and that's anything that causes an energy expenditure. And we're going to look really closely at this coming soon, but this is you're burning calories for a reason. Everything we do burns calories above a basal level, and I really would like to spend more time on that here, but I have a specific place for this later, and I really don't want to give away too much. But that basal level is basically you woke up, you never moved out of bed, you urinated and defecated on yourself all day long, and you stayed in bed. That's your basal level, and it's going to cost you to do that. You're still going to spend calories to do that. Physical activity is anything above that. And so that may be walking, that may be housework, that may be yard work, that may be at my stand-up desk, which I am right now, and I'm using non-exercise thermogenesis or next type energy expenditure. And so that is an important part of it as well. The third term there, exercise. That's just simply a way of saying we have a structure that we're going to apply to our physical activity. We're not just going to, say, hey, I'll go for a walk every now and again. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say I'm going to walk 3 to 5 times a week for 30 minutes at a time. And that makes it structured. It also makes it repetitive, and it's performed with a goal that improves our fitness. Because if we say 3 to 5 times a week, that's starting to sound very measurable, but also very action-oriented, realistic, and it also has a time attached to it for 30 minutes. So you see, I've applied the SMART goal setup to something that we are going to perform for improved fitness. Next on my list is this. How does it all work together? Well, I need you to first look at the bigger circle, which is body composition. And remember, body composition is your lean mass or your lean muscle versus how much fat you have. And this all gets made up because of these other factors. Number one up there is aerobic conditioning, and that's in our next module. We're going to address that. Number two is your muscle strength and endurance. And number three is your flexibility. These are our three training types that we're going to really address as far as incorporating them into your physical fitness or physical activity or your exercise routine so that you see how to improve your body composition. And the way I do this is I say most of it should come from aerobic conditioning. That's walking, that's running, that's swimming, that's biking. A little of it should be from muscle strength and exercise or muscle strength and endurance training. That's lifting weights or that's CrossFit or things like that. And then a little less of it can even be from flexibility or stretch training, which is also is equally important in getting that necessary body composition that we're probably looking for. So I have some principles for you. These principles are just that. And the way I want you to think about this word, a principle, is a fundamental truth that has to occur. And so with principles, what we have to first understand is kind of what are our current principles. And you're a college student right now, and one of the principles you have as a college student is you're going to have to read a book. You're probably going to have to study. You're probably going to have to write a little bit so that you can develop that education that you're trying to pursue. Well, these are principles of fitness, meaning things that have to happen so that you can get that moderate to vigorous activity in every day without undue fatigue. And so to place this first on our list, that we would have to do things over what's normal. Remember, energy expenditure is kind of our focus here. And so we're going to use energy over the basal level, right? That's part of our physical activity. And to do that It's going to incur maybe loads that we're not always used to. And that's our first term, overload. The amount of training must be more than what we're accustomed to do. If you're used to walking up and down your hall 2 or 3 times a day for work, well, what we're asking you to do is about 20 times so that you start to overload your system. That's how adaptation occurs, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit more here in a moment. But the number 2 is progression. We don't want to go up to 20 laps up and down our hall, tomorrow. We want to do that over a course of time. And so we set up our SMART goal to say that within 2 or 3 weeks, we'll get to 20 laps. But for right now, our 2 to 3 laps has to grow. We have to overload that. That's what we're used to. So maybe I'll double it. Maybe I'll just add 10% to that. Whatever it is, whatever metric really works out, that's kind of independent of the activity. But we have to progress that, and we have to have a goal in mind on where we're going to progress that to. But it's an increase of frequency, which is how often we do it, intensity, how hard we do it, time, how long we do it, and type, what is the mode of which we're going to do that in. That is a progressive principle. Number 3 is specificity. And specificity simply says that physiological changes are highly dependent on the type of physical activity that we do. And I want to kind of redirect. This is type here. Well, this is speaking to that type. And specificity basically is just saying that whatever activity you do will kind of train you to a specific condition. A great example of this is if I want to be a runner, but I never run, then I'm not getting specificity. Eventually, to be a runner, I'm going to have to run. I can't just walk all the time and ride a bike and then expect to go do well on a 5K. It's just simply not going to happen. If I want to run, then I need to train with my goal of running in mind and train towards that. That's specificity. There's some other specificity topics that we'll get to very soon that will help you kind of understand that more. And that's coming in the next 2 modules, and so I think you'll see that a little more clearly. The 4th principle is reversibility, and that's basically simply saying if you don't use it, you lose it. That's correct. And that means that gains are transient if they're not maintained. That means they just go away. I have a friend who said he needed to buy a new sport jacket because he'd been working out and lifting weights and doing some modified pull-ups, and he felt like his back had really grown. And then he kind of quit working out. And he said, I was really getting pumped because my sport jackets were fitting tight, and now they're fitting kind of the normal way they used to. I said, well, you quit working out? And he said, yeah, I quit working out. That's reversibility, and it happens very quickly because the older you are, the more likely it's going to happen even more quickly than that. But we know that this is a true principle that happens because we've seen that in our own lives, especially if you played sports in high school. You notice that some of your conditioning parameters, so to speak, the things that you used to say, oh, I could do this then, but now I can't. Well, you're experiencing reversibility. The next one is rest and recovery. I put this in there because this principle means a lot to me because I find that often in exercise we overlook this. But these are vital moments of physiological rest to allow adaptation and stresses to occur. Or adaptation to those stresses to occur. And I need to get more specific with that as we go through some of these topics, but I have an assignment for you that you'll see where rest and recovery are important, and you'll actually have to look up some specific things about that. And then the final thing is this: specific adaptations to impose demands. If you do not follow overload and progression and specificity, then you won't get very great adaptations. That's where they come, is from those imposed demands, and those 3 principles dictate those adaptations. And so again, I'll make that make more sense as we get into the content-specific things of aerobic conditioning as well as strength and endurance. But for right now, please understand that you will adapt to the imposed demands. It's kind of like this. You may have never gotten out of bed before 6:30 a day in your life, and then all of a sudden you have a summer job, and then you're getting out of bed every day at 6:30. Well, the first few weeks are hard, and then the 4th week is hard, But then after that, you kind of start to get used to it. You're adapting to the imposed demand. It gets easier. It's not always fun, but it gets easier. And so that's kind of the crux of our principles. Again, health.gov, and I want to cover these adult recommendations because many times I find we don't always have a great concept of how much time should I spend. This is the frequency as well as the duration of our exercise. And what we know is that adults need a mix of physical activity, and this is the optimal way of exercise. And so if we look here, we see that the government website says we need 150 minutes per week of moderate, intense aerobic activity. And then 2 days a week, we need to spend time working on our muscles, lifting weights or doing CrossFit or something like that. And so how do we do this? Well, if we look back at these 150 minutes, it says you bike, you swim, you walk your dog or you run, you do some wheelchair basketball, you just get outside. But the idea of moving continuously, and that's kind of where we're looking at in the next module, the aerobic conditioning module, where we'll see some examples of that and we'll see specifics. But then 2 days a week, hey, you got to be in the gym or at home doing some type of resistance training. And we'll look at that in the next module after aerobic conditioning in our muscle strength and endurance. Next, I want to say, what do children need to do? You've probably seen a commercial somewhere in some type of professional sports that talk about the 60 minutes of play a day and how important that is to all the development that a kid has to do, but also just their physical development and getting them out there to experience exercise, but not exercise, just physical activity. We're not worried about the structure. We're just worried about them getting out and moving. But again, 60 minutes a day. And then this, what do preschool age children need? Well, they need to be physically active throughout the whole day. Sometimes they're going to take naps. At 3 to 5, my kids are still taking naps, but they need to be physically active the whole day. What the worst thing that can happen is if we pile them in front of a screen and we let that screen permeate their brain with all of the blue light and everything that's coming in there, and they stay there in a very posture poor position for multiple hours a day, developing poor posture, but also poor cognitive habits, and then getting no physical activity. That's the worst thing that can happen. And so please intervene on behalf of a kid. When you see them on a screen, say, hey, look, I've got a ball. Let's go play. And play for 60 minutes. Get them out and get them moving. But if they're 3 to 5 years old, get them out and move them often throughout the day. That's what we find is optimal. And the adult caregivers should encourage that in a variety of ways. It shouldn't be just so specific. And I've got more to say about specificity and kids and sports coming very, very soon. Just hold on. Some key guidelines for women who are pregnant. And I want you to know, I am not a woman. I've never been pregnant, but I've had 4 children with my wife, and I've watched her go through a very sedentary lifestyle and have a very difficult pregnancy. I've watched her move into a very active lifestyle and have very difficult pregnancies in the terms of sickness, but I've watched her come out of those so strong and be able to do so many things that a lot of other women her age with similar pregnancy sickness could not. And so I want to share this with you. This is straight from physical activity guidelines at health.gov. This is not Kendall speaking this. Women should do at least 150 minutes. That's 2 hours and 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity a week. What is aerobic activity? Walking, running, swimming, jogging, biking. Yes, biking is safe, especially if they were doing these things before becoming pregnant. That is a key indicator that they can continue through pregnancy. My wife, very specifically, I remember on our 3rd child, ran 16 miles on the day of the 16th week of her pregnancy. And she was really proud because that was kind of a landmark thing. And then she started tapering back after that. But she knew she'd kind of get away with it at that point. And so she did. And she just had a really great pregnancy. Again, she was sick a lot, but that had very little to do with the fact that she was active and more to do with the fact that she was just pregnant. And that's just one of the byproducts of pregnancy. It also says in the second paragraph, women who habitually engage in vigorous intensity aerobic activity or who were physically active before pregnancy can continue during pregnancy and postpartum. Number 3, women who are pregnant should be under the care of a healthcare provider who can monitor the progress of the pregnancy. This is really critical and kind of a carryover from sexual health or reproductive health. If you are pregnant, please make sure you have a provider who is watching over that. This is not something you want to do alone. And many times I think females feel like they're left to that because of where they're at in their socioeconomic status or something like that. There are people out there to help you, and we're going to try to include some links in the class on resources of where to go if you need that help very, very soon. So, key guidelines for adults with chronic health conditions and adults with disabilities. This too, again, take a look, should at least be 150 minutes to 300 minutes a week. So we're actually up in the game here. If you have a chronic disease, then you need a lot more time. But again, look at the intensity. It's moderate intensity. And then it says if you want to do vigorous, that's 75 to 150. So what we've seen is as the intensity kind of went up, the duration went down. As the duration went up, the intensity comes down, and vice versa. So you see how that has a very unique but offset in the way that it works. And so we need to pay attention to that, especially if you have a chronic illness. But number 2, adults with chronic conditions or disabilities who are able should do muscle strengthening activities. In physical therapy, when I have a patient who has, for instance, COPD, we always want to make sure we're working those muscles. Muscle is a very important part of our body. As we grow older, it gets more and more important. We're going to address that as we go through that next 2 modules. But I want you to see, especially in this third part, when adults with chronic conditions or disabilities are not able to meet the above key guidelines, they should engage in regular physical activity according to their abilities. And that's a critical safety issue. Some folks are not always able to do that, or should at least be supervised and instructed as it carries on very carefully. So that brings me to this, the FITT formula. We've already kind of touched on this, but I want to kind of readdress it because this is critical going forward. In fact, your semester, your course project has a lot to do with this. But frequency, how often should you do it? We're going to spend a lot of time on the next 2 modules addressing that to content-specific aerobic and muscle, but how often? And then intensity, how hard? How hard should I go? Should I run as hard as I can for as long as I can? No, absolutely not. Look at the moderate intensity, look at the vigorous intensity, and then look at the durations of which they participate in. Number 3, my time. How long should I work out for? Again, that's very specific to the content. And then your type, what kind? What kind of exercise should you do? I'll tell you this, the kind of exercise you should do is the one you will do. How about that for your answer? Stick with it and you'll be successful every time. So move your way. And in this graph right here, basically what I want to do is introduce you to a term called METs, or metabolic equivalents. And basically this is how much oxygen we're going to use to do our activity. METs are pretty much confined to a exercise modality like a treadmill or a bike, because we don't commonly pay attention to this number otherwise. But here's some really unique things that you can kind of take and kind of put in your back pocket and keep in mind as you go through your exercise routine. Physical activity has 3 different intensities. It has light intensity, it has moderate intensity, it has a vigorous or a maximal intensity. And what does that look like objectively? Well, sleeping is less than 1 MET. And anything less than 3 is light intensity activities. But look at that, you still need energy to sleep. In fact, you're going to use energy throughout that whole nighttime of sleeping to do some very important things. It also says that writing or desk work, that's only like 1.8. So very simple movements, things that I'm doing right now, but I'm still using energy to do it. Now, if I want to kick it up to moderate intensity, I'm either going to get on a bike and pedal at a very light effort, or I'm going to walk at 3.0 miles per hour, or I might walk up to 3.4 to kind of get my meds up a little bit, but notice they only go up by 0.2, so it's not that much. And then if I bicycle just under 10 miles an hour, I'm at 4.0. So these are all kind of moderate activities. As a cyclist, I can tell you that going 10 miles an hour is not very fast. In fact, most of us can do that very, very comfortably on flat roads, even up most hills. So that's a moderate intensity. A vigorous activity, that changes things because this is where we should be going hard. Again, if we're going hard, our duration is low. And so jogging or calisthenics, running, and then rope jumping, those are vigorous activities. I would also tell you that the more vigorous activities, such as sprinting or cycling at a much harder pace, those things kind of tend to come in and see a greater increase in our meds. This is anything greater than 7 and over. And so what we know is that the meds come in and they very much dictate how much energy we're using. And there's more to be said about METs, and I will definitely address those once we get into the aerobic chapter. Another way to talk about intensity is to use Borg scale of perceived rate of perceived exertion. And basically what this guy named Borg did, he came in and he said, look, I'm going to give you a scale. It's going to be a 14-point scale. It's going to go from 6 to 20. And I know that resting heart rate is right around 60 for a good resting heart rate, a normal resting heart rate. And I know that at 200, that's going to be a pretty rapid heart rate and probably responding to some pretty vigorous activity. And so he scaled it out that way. Some of us, as we have taken and assessed our resting pulse rate, our bottom end is right here at 9. Well, that's not where you want it to be at 90. So we need to understand that 6 is optimal. So you kind of have to adjust the scale and understand where it lays for you. But if you're doing something that you would consider very, very light, that's a very objective statement, then you would be in that lower end. But look here for me at number 13, right in the middle of somewhat hard. This is a minimal stimulus threshold, meaning that if you don't work out and feel like it's somewhat hard, you're probably not getting any type of physiological adaptation to that. You're kind of letting it go as, well, I've done this much, but that's about it. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind as you go forward as to how much do I need to do. Well, it's also how hard do I need to do it. And I need to keep it at somewhat hard. That's the minimal stimulus threshold. Another thing that I want to look at here is your type of exercise. That tells you basically what metrics you're going to use. If you're going to run or you're going to cycle or you're going to swim, you need your heart rate to around 75% of your max heart rate. And we'll talk about that in the next module. But that is somewhat hard to do. And then your anaerobic exercise, that kind of is dictated by your goals. And I can't really get into that yet because we haven't covered what some of those might be. But most of the time, you're going to need to be at 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max to get a response that is going to cause adaptation. And that's pretty heavy. And we'll kind of address that when we get into what a 1 rep max is. I'd also like to kind of talk about something called periodization here. And if you are a parent of a child who plays sports, or you think you will be, then I really need you to tune into this conversation right here. Because periodization basically says that we should have phases in our participation. And this is because our body needs time to adapt, but it also needs time to rest. And these 3 phases are very specific. First of all, it says that we have a preparatory phase. And this is different for every sport, but it kind of all comes in the same way. And this is where both volume and intensity are both kind of low. And you'll see that in our graph right there. Nothing's really happening. We're just kind of prepping up. And so think about even a football player who is in early summer. They're doing a little weightlifting, they're doing a little running, maybe some sport-specific drills, but no pads, no hitting, maybe making some passes, things like that. But that's on the drill side. Everything is pretty low, volume and intensity-wise. But as we start to move closer to our participation phase or competitive phase, things change. And what you need to see is that our volume starts to go up and intensity starts to go up. But they can't both be way up high at the same time. That's where injury is going to occur. So one goes up, the other one kind of stays the same, and then we start to bring up intensity into that volume very slowly. So we developed a base. Now we're in a building phase. And then once we hit our peak, our intensity is really, really high. That's because we're playing games every Friday night. But our volume is very, very low. And so that keeps us protected, because if you take both up extremely high levels at one time and you keep it there, eventually injury is going to occur. There's another phase down here, though, that I need to point out, and that's transitional. You see, I treat a lot of kids who play baseball. And the problem is these kids, and when I say kids, I mean 14, 15, 16-year-olds who play baseball in the fall, in the spring, and in the summer. And they never quite get any time off. And these kids are very vulnerable to chronic injury, specifically injury of the heel, like Seaver's disease, of the knee, like Osgood-Schlatters disease, but also just some general overuse syndromes in the hips, and the knees, and the ankles, and the back, and the shoulders. These are the kids that I worry about the most, who never really get a transitional or a low period in their time of participation. And that's a very important thing. It's not a bad thing to give your kid the summer off and let them heal up and let them focus on these things. That is just a personal position. I know that many of you will disagree, especially if you have kids and you're running them through sports all year long. But on another topic, I want to say this. As a person of expertise, and this is where I do have expertise, I will tell you that early specialization, where you play them in baseball all the time, and you never give them the opportunity to work on other types of movements, is predisposing them to early burnout or early and undue injury, which will limit their career inevitably. Take that for what it's worth. I hope you think about that and you research periodization on your own. This is the next thing. Why am I so sore? This is called delayed onset muscle soreness. It happens because you worked a muscle, you overloaded it, you progressed it, you did all those great things that you're supposed to do with the fitness principles, and now you're getting sore. It's completely normal. And it kind of peaks somewhere around 24 to 48 hours. And I'll tell you this, it's relieved by gentle movements of doing the same. I know that when I go out and I do a hard running workout, lots of sprints or intervals or hills, well, the next day if I'll go out and do an easy workout, just easy run, I feel better. It's hard to get going, I understand that, but I'll feel better. Maybe not 100% better, but I'll feel better. And a better is just better. That's what we all go for. I'd like to ask you to investigate what helps to relieve DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS, the best for your sport or for your activity. And then see and report back to me. I'd love to hear what you find. I want to get to this nearly the end slide here and talk a little bit about safety. You have to understand that there are going to be risks involved. Remember, it's better to visit an orthopedic doctor regularly than to ever see a cardiovascular doctor. Those risks are there, they're going to happen, but physical activity is safe for almost everyone. And that's what we know. And the government has kind of put that out there for us. Choose to do types of physical activity that are appropriate for your current fitness level. And that is, if you haven't rollerbladed since you were 10 years old and you're 40, it's not a good idea to start rollerblading, at least not outside down hills where you could fall off the road. Let's not go into why I should make that example, but just trust me on that. Increase physical activity gradually over time. We're going to talk about something called the 10% rule. I like to say that you can increase 10% at a time over a week's period of time and be pretty safe with it, but use good judgment. If 10% seems like too much, then back off. You always reserve the right to retreat and yield to something safe, because I want you to live to fight another day. Protect yourself, use appropriate gear and sports equipment, looking for safe environments, following rules, following the policies. If it says no bikes allowed on this trail, you should not go on that trail. Again, take my word for it. There's a reason that sign is there. They have a policy for a reason. And then the last thing, be under the care of that healthcare provider. Talk to them regularly. If you're not a doctor, nurse, or a healthcare provider, then it's hard for you to interpret some of that information that may be coming your way. So talk to them regularly. Express that you're exercising. Tell them what it is that you're doing as well as your goals. That way, you can have a long, successful physical activity bout with you. Now, I want to say this too. Safety is not just those rules, those guidelines. Safety is application. And I don't understand a lot of times why people negate these other topics right here, but they do. They kind of let them go. First of all, exercise safety is doing a warm up. That is a physiological thing, and we're going to kind of get into that later, but it needs to be about 5 to 10 minutes. It needs to be dynamic, meaning you're doing movements that mimic what it is that you're going to do during your workout, and it needs to get you to 20 to 30 beats per minute of your target heart rate. A cool down is equally important. That means you go in and you stretch out those muscles so that they don't get so tight and they don't get so sore. And you know what? You also kind of return your heart rate to closer to resting, and that's a very good thing as well. You need to learn the skills, and I just put this little comment in. If you want to be rich, you study the life habits of rich people. Well, if you want to learn how to ride a bike up Kavanaugh Hill in Poto, Oklahoma, you got to study people who are doing it. And that's exactly the way I did it. I found a guy who was doing it regularly, and I said, please teach me. And he did. And it was absolutely horrible. And it's horrible every time I've been up since. But I had to learn how to do it. And I didn't know how to do it at first, but I found somebody who did. And that's what's critical. And then gear. Then fuel. You want to look at the right fuel foods at the right time. I'm not going there in depth yet. I've got a whole talk ready to go for food later. We'll get there, but you need to learn how to fuel appropriately. The last thing, don't cheap out on your gear. If you're going to run, buy really good shoes that are ready for you to run in, and try on several pair. If you're going to ride a bike, don't cheap out and buy the cheapest bike you can get. Go ahead and spend a little extra money, especially if you think you're in it for the long run, because gear does matter. Now, there are some apparel that I simply don't think that you need. I buy most of my running clothes from Walmart or Old Navy or Academy, and rarely do they have a swoosh or an X on them. So just keep that in mind. It's not always about what brand you're wearing, as long as it has some quality to it. So, that being said, let's look at what's next. We're going to talk about the quiz here, or you're going to go through the quiz here, and you're going to answer questions from this video. You're also going to look at fitness components and understand that this assignment is going to ask you to go in and prepare some specific things. I'm also going to ask you to go into the next module, which is aerobic training, and I want you to see what it is and the benefits of being aerobically trained. I hope this has been great for you. I'll see you real soon.